Hello, welcome. This video, I'm just going to do a reading of some of Carl Schmitt's writings on Hobbes from his book, The Leviathan in the State Theory of Thomas Hobbes, Meaning and Failure of a Political Symbol. So he's kind of talking about the symbol of the Leviathan and analyzing a lot of Hobbes's understanding of the state and of sovereignty. So, um, this is obviously like if you're not interested in Hobbes or you're not a reader of Hobbes, maybe it's not that interesting. But if you are like me, this is actually pretty good. And it's got this particular chapter, chapter 3, which I'm going to read, is also sort of relevant to theories of kind of human ontology and transhumanism, maybe even because as we'll see in this, Schmitt has this sort of really nice analysis of the Hobbesian state as a force of mechanism, as a force of scientific neutrality, of course, because the point of the Hobbesian revolution, I would say, the kind of modern state in general, and sprung out of modernity, in many ways, is to produce a machine which is kind of scientifically neutral. It's not bound into the sort of interpretive sorts of contests. Hobbes is, as I say, like one person says, well, this is just, another person says, well, this is not just, and you can never really come to a rational agreement, and that's true. It's like, my God is real, no, my God is real. Like that, there is ultimately a kind of epistemic gap that even the best philosophers in the would never be able to concretely, through rational agreement alone, sort of overcome. And this epistemic kind of discontinuity or epistemic dissonance is what Hobbes sees as the cause of a lot of violent conflict and civil disunity. So one person says, no, I know what the just and the good is. Another person says, no, I know what the just and the good is. And basically, there's no way to actually kind of prove what it is, in the same way that you can sort of prove, I don't know, in a jury, you can use like scientific evidence to prove if someone is guilty, is there fingerprints on the gun, or you know what I mean? Like there's kind of within these categories of the good, the just, and so forth, there is always this um, incapacity to empirically or merely rationally come to a full agreement. Of course, we can come to some sort of agreement, but maybe not full agreement. And that is what Hobbes considers the problem with human cognition is, the problem with human knowledge creation is. So yeah, and like that is basically, I think, true in many ways. But what it is true. Like Socrates, aporia, perplexion. We get to a certain point where we think about what justice is, we think about what courage is, and so forth, and then we can use rational discourse to understand that we don't know what it is, but we often can't really concretely, get a thing which we can verbally define in an absolute sense that everyone's going to be happy with. So this is not a controversial thing to say. What Hobbes does with it, of course, is, well, therefore we need this kind of mechanistic state, this sovereign, this Leviathan, in order to control the civil order, which we, of course, kind of draw ourselves into a covenant with in order to protect us from civil strife. So, what Hobbes does with, obviously, what emerges out of this observation of an epistemic limit in human beings is, of course, the next kind of political step, which is open to interpretation. And anyway, so maybe I'll just start reading, but this is kind of what Schmitt is basically talking about, just to give some background into what we're talking about, in case you're not that familiar with Hobbes. Okay, so I'll start reading. But what is the significance of the image of the Leviathan in the intellectual context and in the conceptual and systemic construction of Hobbes's theory of the state? The starting point of Hobbes's construction of the state is fear of the state of nature. The goal and terminus is security of the civil, the stately condition. In the state of nature, everyone can slay everyone else. Everyone can do this great feat. In respect to posing and carrying out this threat, all are equal. As Hegel characterized it, everyone is weak vis-a-vis everyone else. To this extent, democracy prevails in the state of nature. Democracy, quote unquote. He put it in quotation brackets. Everyone knows that everyone can slay everyone else. Everyone is therefore the foe and competitor of everyone else. The well-known bellum omnium. My Latin is not good. Bellum omnium contra omnes. War of all against all. In the civil, stately condition, all citizens are secure in their physical existence. There reign peace, security, and order. This is a familiar definition of police. Modern state and modern police came into being simultaneously as the most vital institution of the security state, that is the police. It is astonishing that Hobbes appropriated a characteristic of the condition of peace brought about by police, the formula of Francis Bacon of Verulum, by speaking of man becoming God to man, homo homini duus, whereas in the state of nature, man was a wolf to man, homo homini lupus. Continuously apologizing for my terrible mispronunciation of Latin words. The terror of the state of nature drives anguished individuals to come together. Their fear rises to an extreme. A spark of reason flashes. Suddenly, there stands in front of them a new God. That's a beautiful line. I want to read that again. The terror of the state of nature drives anguished individuals to come together. Their fear rises to an extreme. A spark of reason flashes, and suddenly there stands in front of them a new God. They don't make them like this anymore, do they? They don't, these writers, they can define something so well. Um, well, they do have good writers today, but you know what I mean. That is an exceptional paragraph right there. So anyway, in more theoretical terms, this is important because we're talking about Hobbes's mechanism. This is kind of what Schmitt is getting to. We're gonna see this being drawn out as I read. But Hobbes's mechanism is the transformation of humans into a god, in this sense, because out of their fear of the state of nature, out of their fear of that state of nature, there's a kind of Promethean. The state here can be looked at in a kind of Promethean manner. Out of a fear of the state of nature, this sort of idea flashes, and we construct this thing called the state. And it's godlike in its capacity to achieve what human beings on their own cannot achieve. There's a sort of, I would say there's also a theme of prosthesis here, a kind of prosthetic. The state is a kind of prosthetic. If we're looking at those theories of technology, again, that German philosopher Ernst Kapp, interesting. He had this idea of organ projection, that technologies were sort of like prosthetics that overcome weaknesses of ourselves. And I suppose the state has that function. It's a kind of prosthetic institution that overcomes the kind of weakness of being one against everyone else. Yeah. So. Okay. So I'll keep reading. Who is this God who brings peace and security to people tormented by anguish, who transforms wolves into citizens, and through this miracle proves himself to be a God, obviously a mortal God, a Deus mortalis, as Hobbes called him. So just also another comment. Something particularly if you're interested in Nietzsche, and if you're interested in what the book I've written, which I'll put the link in the description, about the civilizing principle. Um, this state, I mean, this is a bit of a tangent. Really, you want to read Nietzsche and also Plato if you want to think more about kind of pedagogy and civilizing. But there is also an element to the creation of this God that we create, as a out of our fear. And it's fear. Remember, that's fear, right? It's not trade. It's not, oh, we want to make money. It's not we want to fuck each other. It's not like, oh, let's make technology because it would, like, I hate washing the dishes. Wouldn't it be nice if I had a dishwasher? This kind of bourgeois theories of technology and human reason and human innovation. Schmitt is not in that camp. Schmitt is in a different camp, which maybe I'll explain these camps in a different video. But Schmitt is in the camp of this sort of the state emerges out of fear and out of the sort of chaos of the world, and ordering that kind of social chaos in order to preserve ourselves, and in order also to not feel constantly exposed, which I think is quite understandable. No one wants to feel like constantly exposed to the sort of chaos of anyone can like stab me when I sleep, or anyone can do this or that, right? So, so what also, when we create this state, the state also then sort of tries to transform us into citizens, from wolves into citizens. And there, you do perhaps have a critique. There's room for critique, for example. There's room for a critique of the state's function in that regard. I think a Gambin, for example, would be a good person to read there. Nietzsche is a good person to read there. Okay, I'll keep reading. The expression of mortal God has led to many misunderstandings and misinterpretations. The confusion is so great because Hobbes used three distinctly different representations for this quote-unquote God. In the forefront stands conspicuously the notorious mythical Leviathan, that is a simulated God, man, animal, and machine. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. This is where Schmidt's really bringing out the fucking big guns here. This is like, okay, so the Leviathan, this weird monster, and remember, think about this, right? Think about this. The Leviathan is a biblical monster. Hobbes has chosen a biblical monster to represent the thing which saves us from like chaos and fear and hurt, right? This is not like God saving us. Sorry, like the thing saving us is some sort of angelic, perfect creature. And again, this is where I'm going on a tangent here, but whatever. This is where kind of progressives who think, oh, we can build this perfect system and this perfect society, and it's not just progressives in the contemporary sense. I mean progressive in like even like the Victorian era sense of the word, right? Who aren't like social progressives always necessarily. Well, sometimes they are, but always necessarily in like the modern terms of like progressive means you're all for whatever LGBT or something. No, like progressive in the sense of you have a view of the capacity for human innovation and organization and reason in order to build a civilization or a society. And that civilization and society is kind of angelic, it's perfect, it's blah 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 blah, it's right. The symbol Hobbes chooses is a monster. It's a monster. It's something which is between humans, machines, animals, and gods. It's this sort of ontological, incestuous freak, right? Anyway, so I'll keep reading. Next to it serves a juridically constructed covenant to explain the appearance of one sovereign person brought about by representation. In addition, Hobbes transfers, and that seems to me to be the gist of his philosophy of state, the Cartesian conception of man as mechanism with a soul onto the huge man, the state made by him into a machine animated by the sovereign representation of person. Okay, so this is what I think he means by this. Is again like this is what I think he means by this. The Cartesian understanding of mechanistic body with immaterial kind of subjective mind. And in this sense, and again, it fits the idea of a prosthesis, because in this sense, the immaterial mind, the subjective reasonable mind of a person can sort of like almost transplant his mind into this machine called the state and sort of maneuver it. He can use this machine like a prosthetic, I would say, in order to sort of carry out the obligations of order, basically keeping a social and civil order. The subjective immaterial mind controls this mechanistic system. Okay. That the state is characterized as God has no particular meaning in Hobbes' construction of the state. To the extent that this characterization does not constitute a mere turning point of the Middle Ages or the time of Louis XIV, it projects a strong polemical thrust. Whoever defends the rights of the state against the claims of the God-invoking Pope or Presbyterians and Puritans cannot simply relinquish the divinity to his opponents and to the church. The German historian Gisbert Bayerhaus and Karl Theodor Buderberg have shown that in the concept of sovereignty in modern public law, Calvin's concept of God and his legibus salutis appears in secularized forms. The eminent English authority of this epoch of religious wars and conceptualizations of the state, John Neville Figgis, said that the God of Calvinism is the Leviathan of Hobbes, an omnipotence that is unchecked by law, justice, or conscience. For Hobbes, God is above all power. He used the traditional formulation of the Christian Middle Ages regarding the public sovereignty, namely, governor of God on earth, instead of governor of the Pope on earth, inferring the godlike character of the sovereign from his almighty supreme state power does not, however, provide a justification in the sense of an intellectual demonstration. The sovereign is not the defensor pacis of a peace traceable to God. He is the creator of none other than an earthly peace. So again, this section, there's a lot to be interpreted here, a lot to be said about this section. My feeling here is that he's trying to draw out this again, like this godlike role of the sovereign, someone here on earth, someone who sort of acts in the role of God nearly. Yeah, basically, I would say so. There's an emphasis in Hobbes, of course, in man creating his own order. That order is not if you compare Hobbes, for example, to the Stoics. I think you could say like the Stoics kind of believe in the order of the cosmos. There is a lot of suffering. There is a lot of conflict in the world, and it's not like the Stoics lived in a society where there was no law or anything, or like no order. There was, of course, like human beings need to organize themselves. They need to keep things moving and in check, and people need certain roles, and there needs to be certain authorities, all that, blah, blah, blah. I mean, obviously. But their sort of metaphysical view of the world is one in which, yes, there appears a lot of chaos and a lot of conflict in the world we live in here on Earth, but within the cosmos, there is a divine order to it all, I suppose you could say. I mean, maybe that's not the best description of Stoicism, but there is something to that. And Hobbes, I think, would say no, like the order is really, really, really just our creation. There's no sort of pre-given order to things. I suppose that's the point of making this massive distinction between a state of nature and between a civil order is that you're sort of saying that like there is no order, there is no sense to things until we create one, whereas whereas pre-Hobbesian views of the world, I mean, I'm using Stoicism as just one particular example, would be something like, no, like we do have to order ourselves and so on, but there is a kind of pre-existing order of things before that moment. Therefore, there's no point in making this great dualistic distinction between a state of nature and a civil order. Okay, so he is a creator passus. The justification provided, on the contrary, proceeds the other way around. And in the thought processes of divine right, because the state power is supreme, it possesses divine character. But its omnipotence is not at all divinely derived. It is a product of human work and comes about because of a covenant entered into by man. Exactly. So that's kind of basically what I'm saying. Like this covenant entered into by man is not, it's not a divinely derived thing. It's not providence and so forth. It's entered into by man. Man has to choose it. The decisive element of the intellectual construction resides in the fact that this covenant does not accord with medieval conceptions of an existing commonwealth forged by God and of the pre-existent natural order. Yeah, kind of repeating what I was saying there. The state as order and commonwealth is the product of human reason and human inventiveness and comes about by virtue of the covenant. This covenant is conceived in an entirely individualistic manner. All ties and groupings have been dissolved. Fear brings atomized individuals together. A spark of reason flashes, and consensus emerges about the necessity to submit to the strongest power. Okay, yeah, and again, this is one of the reasons that I really think we need to read Hobbes today, or Schmitt's interpretation of Hobbes, because like if you look at recent events like the state of emergency, and again I think because of Agamben, Agamben has kept alive a sort of historical link between contemporary breakdowns in liberal democracies that result in these states of emergencies and the history of thought which deal with these issues from Schmitt to Hobbes and so forth. So you know, you have this kind of psycho-political tendency, particularly in the modern world, of fear motivates a use of reason. Fear and reason here sort of work together in this sort of motivational sense, and fear ends with reason, ends with submission to some sort of strong power, right? And if you think about the COVID lockdowns, for example, that's sort of played out a lot. Although the power in the situation with the lockdowns wasn't, I wouldn't say it was like a traditional political authority by any means. I think the power in the lockdowns was a kind of sect or a clerisy almost of experts and public health managers and so on. So, but nonetheless, some sort of mechanism, some sort of power structure is submitted to when fear emerges. And then of course we have to think about, well, how does fear, here you can kind of get into Paul Virilio maybe, how does fear mislead us into political and social situations that we don't want to be in, right? How does fear do that? And how does the media manipulate our fear? How does digital technology sort of inflate and exaggerate our fear? How does education operate to make us more scared? Should education not sort of help us overcome fear so that we don't end up in these stupid situations? I mean, to some extent, maybe we could say in a very kind of Hobbesian realism, preservation will always reign, no matter how sort of strong-willed you are as people. Preservation will always fear driven by self-preservation will always win out, and you will submit to some sort of authority. Perhaps that's true, but nonetheless, I do think there's room to think about how fear perhaps too hastily gets us into these positions of submitting ourselves to power. And how fear can be manufactured, and how fear can be part of the kind of so-called manufacturing of consent, and so on and so forth. These are all really important issues, I would say. So I'll keep reading. If this construct were viewed from its results, from the perspective of the state, what it would reveal is that the state is something more than and something different from a covenant concluded by individuals. The assemblage of men gathered together by the fright of fiends cannot, from the presuppositions of their gathering, overcome hostility. The pluralistic state of nature cannot be transferred, as Paul Ritterbusch aptly said, by using analytic concepts of rationalism to an entirely different condition of unity and peace. Even though a consensus of all with all has been achieved, this agreement is only an anarchico-social, not a state covenant. What comes about as a result of this social covenant, the sole guarantor of peace, the sovereign representative person, does not come about as a result of, but because of this consensus. The sovereign the sovereign representative person is much more than the sum total of all the participating particular wills. To be sure, the accumulated anguish of individuals who fear for their lives brings a new power into the picture, the Leviathan. But that affirms rather than creates this new God. To that extent, the new God is transcendent vis-a-vis all contractual partners of the covenant and vis-a-vis the sum total, obviously only in a juristic and not in a metaphysical sense. Okay, so I suppose here what he's saying is that this thing which is created, this entity, this state which we all go into covenant with when we want to overcome the kind of state of fear, state of nature that we're in. This thing is not just the sum of the parts. It's not just the sum of all the individuals that are consenting to it, right? It transcends that. The intrinsic logic of the man-made artificial product state does not culminate in a person, but in a machine. Not the representation by a person, but the factual current accomplishment of genuine protection is what the state is all about. So not the representation by a person, but the factual current accomplishment of genuine protection is what the state is all about. So what's important in Hobbesian, what's important about the modern state, and what's important within the Hobbesian turn, is that, so we have these personalities, these leaders, these politicians and so forth, and their representation of this sovereignty is not as important as the actual machine itself. So the machine itself, which guarantees protection, that's what the most important thing is. And you can think here, I think, a little bit of like, traditional aristocracies or something where, the representation is very important, because you have to have like a legit, like, the king dies and the prince takes over. There's a kind of legitimate heir. There's a legitimate heir which takes over. And it's kind of more personalized. It's more particular. It's more human. He's the king. This person is not the king. They're illegitimate and so forth. That's our king. That's who we submit to. And we're not going to fucking submit to this fraud. Like, you can imagine, like, some other person steps into the position of the sovereign in like a medieval kingdom, or like, and everyone's like, who the fuck are you? You're not our king. Whereas in the Hobbesian view of the modern state, it's the machine which guarantees the protection is more important than the representation. Which is something which is interesting to think about, of course. I think that's a good distinction to make. Okay, representation is nothing if It is not a tutela praesens. That, however, can only be attained by an effectively functioning mechanism of command. The state that came into being in the 17th century and prevailed on the continent of Europe is in fact a product of men and differs from all earlier kinds of political units. It may even be regarded as the first product of the age of technology, the first modern mechanism in a grand style, as a machina machinarum in Hugo Fischer's appropriate formulation. I love the way Schmitt just quotes people constantly that I've absolutely never heard of before. Um, with that state has what was created not only an essential intellectual or sociological precondition for the technical industrial age that followed, but also the typical, even prototypical work of the new technological era, the development of the state itself. So here Schmitt is drawing a more of a close comparison link between kind of the technological era, the industrial era of mankind, and our social formation within this, creating a modern state. It's not like, oh look, this is a kind of creation of a sort of social order, and it's just the kind of human social order, blah 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 blah. It's something which emerges and is intrinsic itself to the technological pursuits of modernity. The state is in that sense much more of a technological form of authority and form of sovereignty than like medieval or classical forms of social organization and authority. Consequently, the sovereign representative person could not hinder the mechanization of the image of the state that occurred in the following century. Time bound to the 17th century, it expressed the idea of representation of the Baroque and of the state or princely absolutism. It found a beautiful and simple expression in a statement by James Stewart, who said that the king always stands on a public stage. In Hobbes, the state is not in entirety a person. The sovereign representative person is only the soul of the huge man state. I'm gonna read that again. In Hobbes, the state is not in its entirety a person. The sovereign representative person is only the soul of the huge man state. So again, you just make it. You just kind of again to kind of feed back into this monstrosity, this symbol of the monster, the Leviathan, this monstrosity. It is it is um um the sovereign is a machine, part man of course, but he's a machine. And again, to relate that back to the kind of dualistic turn of Cartesian philosophy, you have a person mind, you have a human rational mind, um but he's being, in a sense, you know, if you've okay, so I'll give you an example. If you've ever seen the film, I can't remember what it's called, but it's Bruce Willis, and if you're interested in basically the philosophy or the themes of disembodiment, this is something you need to watch. It's a cheesy Hollywood film, but it's quite good in a sense, because it shows the invention of artificial bodies, and these artificial bodies can basically, like a computer chip in your brain, you can sort of transplant your mind into a cyborg body, like, you know, like a C3PO kind of thing. Except the C3PO looks like a human and blah blah blah, talks like a human, blah blah blah, and you transplant your mind into the machine. So there's this kind of transplantation of your res cognitans into the res extensus of a machine, and something, an early formation of this is basically going on with the building of a state, because the sovereign is sort of transplanting, I would say, his human mind into a machine. Where are we? This personalistic element too is drawn into the mechanization process and becomes absorbed by it. As a totality, the state is body and soul, a homo artificialis, and as such a machine. It is a man-made product. Its material and maker, materia et artifex, machine and engineer are one and the same, namely men. Also, the soul thereby becomes the mere component of a machine artificially manufactured by men. Thus, the huge man, as a sovereign representative person, could not prevail in history, for he himself was nothing but a product of human art and human intelligence. The Leviathan thus becomes none other than a huge machine, a gigantic mechanism in the service of ensuring the physical protection of those governed. Hobbes by no means turns the state constructed by human beings into the civil peace that it engenders into an earthly paradise. He's equally far removed from Bacon's Atlantis as from the dreams of paradise of 18th and 19th century humanitarian enthusiasts of progress. State and revolution, Leviathan and Behemoth are actually or potentially always present. The introduction of the Leviathan does not have some ulterior meaning, as it's suggested by opening the secret side door to the dreamland of excessive fantasies, which some rationalists use to introduce the other side of their rationalism. A very famous example of this is the depiction of is a depiction by Condorcet in his, okay, this is in French. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. I think the English translation is A Paradise of Mankind Brought About by Human Reason and Education. Here one finds some resemblance to the basic constructs of Hobbes. Life is of interest only insofar as it concerns the here and now, the physical existence of the individual, the actual living beings. The most important and highest goal is security and the possible prolongation of this kind of physical existence. The great mathematician Condorcet considers the problem of immortality to be a mathematically infinitesimal one problem of sorry, sorry. The great mathematician Condorcet considers the problem of immortality to be a mathematically infinitesimal one, and believes that in the infinity of time, by an ever gradual postponement of death from old age, the nuisance of dying will finally cease, and everybody will become a kind of Methuselah, don't know that reference, whereby he attains a kind of worldly eternity. Okay, I'm just gonna stop reading for a second. So so he's kind of just basically comparing kind of Hobbes's more kind of realism and with some of the more kind of utopian progressive views of the state which emerged in the 18th century as well. For example, this guy Condorcet, who is kind of similar to today. This guy Brian Johnson, this kind of tech billionaire dude who thinks we can all live, I don't know, 200 years old if we manage our diets the right way and we live according to this like weird kind of process of micromanaging all of our habits and diets and so on and so forth, so we can kind of use our human reason to extend our life, blah blah blah. It's interesting because these sorts of themes are coming up again in our time, because I think it's because of certain technological changes. But we increasingly have today sort of like two views of the state and of technology, and one is more Hobbesian, this kind of states of emergencies, preservation, and so forth, and one is more kind of one is more progressive. We can, Elon Musk, we can wire our brains to computers and blah blah blah. We can live forever if we manage our diets the right way, blah blah blah. So a lot of this kind of like late 18th century stuff is sort of re-emerging, I would say, in our world today. Okay, but where are we? In Condorcet, the state of the absolute princes of the European continent, especially in France, is presented as having performed its historic task for more than a century. The police having provided well for public security and order. Condorcet therefore no longer considered man to be radically evil and wolf-like, but good and educable. In this phase of the rationalist doctrine, the compulsory and educational work of the state was regarded as historically time-bound, a transient affair, and at any rate it was expected that the state would make itself superfluous in time. In other words, the dawn of a day when the great Leviathan would be slaughtered was already visible. So, yeah, so you have this idea at the time, and again, that kind of came out again in in Marxism in the 20th century. You had this idea of, or the 19th and 20th century, I suppose. You had this idea that the state was sort of like become kind of irrelevant. Um, Man would kind of historically transform himself to be good and virtuous enough to the point where you didn't really need this big state to control his affairs and so on and so forth. That didn't really work out, but you see anyway that these opposing forms of rationalism, I suppose we could call it. Yeah, that's probably the best way to think of it. These opposing forms of rationalism have been going on in modernity for all of modernity, and we're still living inside of that. Hobbes was far removed from such conceptions. Although his theory admits the possibility of exerting influence through compulsion and education, he had no great illusion about human nature. He understood that man is more asocial than an animal, full of anguish and worry about the future, driven not only by present but also by potential hunger, fame, futura. I think again, these are the Latin words: fame, future, um, familicus. I don't know what the meaning of that word is. Possessed by passion of prestige and rivalry, he is at all times determined and ready to trample on reason and logic in order to secure for himself immediate momentary advantage. Okay, so yeah, and again, this is if you're familiar with my channel and my work, I talk about thymos quite a lot, and thymos is basically the thing which Hobbes is pointing to here, in which excuse me, I'm just adjusting my microphone. In which desire for glory, desire for prestige, and so forth emerges from. It's the kind of psychological disposition. And Hobbes, of course, sees this as being a problematic feature of human nature, which interferes with the capacity to have this sort of civil order and preservation and so on and so forth. Okay, but the more dangerously this social individualism, this is quote unquote individualism, I think, again, I wouldn't take that to be the meaning of the word individualism we have today, but anyway, asserts itself, the stronger becomes the rational necessity for reaching a general peace. The difficult problem of fitting the rebellious and self-seeking man into a social commonwealth is finally resolved, but not only with the help of human intelligence. Luckily, all men aren't simply pure wolves. They are endowed with intelligence, even though in the state of nature, the wage of the war against... even though in the state of nature, they wage the war of all against all. In this respect, Hobbes' construction of the state is still valid. That the rebellious fierceness and obstinacy of individuals must be overcome with the help of reason or intelligence is self-evident even today to those who subscribe to scientific, not utopian thinking. Such a construction, for example, is to be found in the 1934 lecture by Karl Esterich titled Termiten von, although Escherich was evidently not consciously influenced by Hobbes. From those theories, he deviated on many points. Yet, on this decisive point, his argument showed the same structure as Hobbes and is therefore well suited to elucidate the problem. In contrast to Hobbes, Escherich compared the states of ants, termites, and bees with the state of humans. Yet simultaneously, and in doing so, he was in agreement with Hobbes. He drew a distinction between the political bent of ants and other insects with that of people. So, Okay, I'll keep reading it and then I'll comment. Whereas the states of ants, termites, and bees became possible only by the total extinction of their sexuality, the formation of the human state was infinitely more complex because man had not given up his sexuality and thus has retained his entire rebellious individualism. Man has a brain and intellect, and this has enabled him to form the state without extinguishing his sexuality. So, okay. So that I want to break that down. What exactly this means, and I think we could use. Okay, this is actually a really interesting topic. So let's break this down to in what sense ants and bees. Why are they talking about insects? What has this got to do? And again, if you haven't read Hobbes, you might find this a bit confusing and nonsensical. But I have read Hobbes, so I will give you an explanation. Um, Hobbes, sorry, Aristotle said that insects were political animals because they shared these sorry the, you can see insects forming complex social structures. So like a colony. So for example, ants, an ant colony. There's actually like certain roles in the colony. There's like the worker ones, and I don't know what the other ones are, but you know what I mean. The builder ones and the worker ones and the soldier ones. You have this sort of like this. You have these sorts of roles within ants or bee colonies, something like this, right? Which suggests complex social organization. And Aristotle said that therefore you could categorize insects as political animals because they have somewhat of a complex social organization in which they all share a single goal, and that goal is survival and reproduction. So they don't just have this shared goal of survival and reproduction, they organize themselves into something which is somewhat complex, specific roles in order to obtain those goals. So in that sense, they're political animals. And Hobbes famously said, no, they're not, because at least humans are different insofar that humans have other these other motivations which complicate them. So humans have a desire for glory and prestige. Therefore, and insects don't have that, right? So it's not exactly a great equivalency. And uh, 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 humans have these tendencies which distinguish them from other animals, which actually make them more likely and prone to conflict and disunity. So I suppose what this person is saying here is human sexuality, because I presume what they're referring to is the fact that I think with bee colonies and ant colonies, there's like some sort of queen, and then you just have a bunch of like kind of worker and soldier ants, bees, and then they all just, I don't know, they all have sex with the queen. They all share. It's kind of like it's kind of like a harem or something. I don't know. A kind of reversed harem where they all share the same kind of sexual reproductive thing. They don't have their own individual sexual relations. I think it's the individual sexual relations which gives us room for conflict and disunity. I think that's what this person is referring to here. So basically, humans have tendencies towards conflict. Humans have certain psychological and anthropological needs and tendencies which make us more conflict prone than other animals, we could say. But in the construction of the human state, says Escherich, the foundation is dependent on the mightily developed brain. Only by virtue of this central organ, endowed with an almost unlimited plasticity, did it become possible to confront the enormous hindrances in the formation of the state, to overcome them by means of experience and insight into the advantage of state formation, and as such, without the organic sacrifice of individuality, and without the mechanization to attain a community life and society. Okay, so, let put it this way. I'll give you another example to compare ants and bees. Ants are have this sort of very collectivized kind of sense of purpose. You know, you'll see an ant colony all working together to like build a hive, build a whatever, a kind of den where it lives. They all they sort of spontaneously go into these specific roles. They have like workers and soldiers and blah blah blah, and and they seem very organized. One thing that makes them organized is chemicals. Biologists will tell you that ants, for example, will follow chemical trails. So chemicals will sort of leak out of, I don't know, the ants' buttholes or something. I don't know, and this will just kind of create this kind of chemical spontaneous sense of activity. Their activity is not driven by reason. It's driven by sort of chemical stimuli. So if you ever seen a video, if you look up on YouTube, like an ant colony going in circles, that's because the chemicals have sort of stimulated that behavior. The chemicals of the way in which chemicals are released by ants in order to alert other ants that they should do this or not do that is basically the chemical stimuli. It's sort of being disrupted, or it's something's happened to that chemical stimuli in a kind of disruptive manner, in which in which um in which uh, the entire collective colony starts behaving in this kind of peculiar way where they just walk around in circles. Just walk around in circles, walk around in circles. Humans don't have like chemical stimuli like that. They have reason. Like where we have reason, and reason is the capacity for us to organize into a complex manner. Other animals have something like insects have something like chemical stimuli. So reason has facilitated for us the capacity to sort of organize ourselves into a collective, but also sort of retain our individuality to some level as well. We're not completely controlled by chemical stimuli or something like this. We're not completely controlled by the collective. We are sort of in agreement with it because of and we have the capacity to be in agreement with it because of our rational need for collective self-preservation, but we also can retain some sort of individuality. And that does play out, I think, to some extent in human ontology. Human ontological reality does seem to play that out. Like, the if you look at insects again, the way their sexuality is formed, and the way, like, they're sort of trapped inside certain behavioral stimulations of chemicals and so forth, does kind of show you that like humans are ontologically sort of gifted to be able to organize complexly without being insects, basically. Without giving up our sexuality, without just being controlled by chemicals or something. So the next time you're in like the bus station and someone farts, think of insects, because that's basically the way insects behave. They just fart at each other all day, and those farts let everyone know what to do. So that's kind of an interesting reference. Okay, so the decisive step occurred when the state was conceived as a product of human calculation. Everything else, for example, the development of the clock mechanism to the steam engine, to the electric motor, to the chemical or biological processes, are the results of an evolution of technology and scientific thinking, and do not require any new metaphysical resolution. La Mitre, the notorious author of Homme Machine, 1748, wrote Le Homme Planté in a similar vein, following the path paved by Hobbes. I don't know that one. That's an interesting reference. I'll look that up. Through the mechanization of this huge man, Hobbes leapt decisively ahead of Descartes and made a significant contribution to the anthropological interpretation of man. Okay, this is where it gets interesting. Nevertheless, the first metaphysical leap was made by Descartes at precisely the moment when the human body was conceived to be a machine, and the human being, consisting of body and soul, was postulated to be in its entirety and an intellect intent on a machine. The transfer of this conception to the huge man, the state, was thus near. It was consummated by Hobbes. It led, however, to the transformation of the soul of the huge man into a part of a machine. After the body, the soul of the huge man became a machine. The transfer back became possible, and even the little man could become a homing machine. The mechanization of the concept of the state thus completed the mechanization of the anthropological image of man. The end. Well, at least the end of that chapter. One of the best chapters, probably some of the best Hobbesian interpretation ever done. Super recommend this. And it ends on that kind of worrying note of the more that our image of sovereignty is mechanized, the more that our machine is the more we have this kind of dualistic mechanization of a state. It's not simply that we can sort of transplant our subjective minds into that system, into that machine, and use it for our own benefit, and then just get out of it and be like, oh, that's cool, we're all good. No, the more we use, the more throughout modernity we could say that a mechanized form of social organization and of a state has emerged, the more man himself in his anthropological image is mechanized. And therefore, you can think of all sorts of contemporary things here, transhumanism and so on and so forth, where that seems to be playing out. This sort of feedback of the mechanization is no longer just our tool, which we can use for our own human goods. The machine starts to turn us into something, perhaps, that is good for it, right? So, anyway, ontological, it's incest. This is ontological incest that he's describing. This is like kind of mechanized bestialization, ontological incest, all this ambiguity and all these interesting things. So anyway, I'll leave it there. I recommend this book. That's all I will say.